There's something profoundly unsettling about encountering a narcissist. It's not just that they're manipulative or self-absorbed, it's that they distort reality itself. They invert truth, corrupt your sense of self, and twist your virtues into vulnerabilities. And if you're not careful, if you're not damn careful, you'll find yourself living in a psychological fog, stripped of identity, autonomy, and purpose. But here's the thing, you can win. Not in the petty sense, not through revenge or ego, but by transcending the game entirely. Defeating a narcissist isn't about overpowering them. It's about outgrowing the very dynamic they thrive in. It's about discovering something deeper in yourself, something stable, sovereign, and incorruptible. So today, I want to walk you through 8 signs, clear, undeniable indicators that you've not only defeated the narcissist, but reclaimed your inner world. These are signs that you've stepped out of chaos and into a kind of psychological order, a kind of freedom. And that, I would argue, is no small thing. One of the clearest and most profound indicators that you have defeated a narcissist is when you no longer require their approval to maintain a sense of your own value. You see, narcissists survive psychologically, emotionally by positioning themselves as the arbiters of worth. They create an environment where your successes are minimized, your failures are exaggerated, and your entire identity becomes contingent on their shifting and often arbitrary opinion. It's a deeply parasitic dynamic. And for a time, it feels almost inescapable. You find yourself craving the smallest scraps of validation, much like a starving man hungers for crumbs, even though those crumbs ultimately keep him imprisoned. When you're entangled with a narcissist, your identity becomes fragmented. Every compliment they give, every moment of approval is laced with the implicit threat that it could be withdrawn at any moment. You learn to second-guess yourself. You adapt your behavior to maintain favor. You start to wear a mask crafted not from authenticity but from survival. This is not love. This is not respect. This is a slow erosion of the soul. But once you've truly severed that dependency, once you've recognized that their validation is not only unnecessary but fundamentally corrupt, you begin to reclaim territory that you never should have surrendered in the first place. You start to rebuild a self grounded not in external approval, but in an internal alignment with truth. Not the narcissist truth, which is mutable and self-serving, but objective reality. The undeniable facts of your competence, your effort, your value as a sovereign individual. This shift doesn't happen all at once. It comes in small but significant moments. The first time you recognize a backhanded compliment for what it is, an attempt at control rather than a genuine expression of appreciation. The first time you assert yourself without waiting to see how they will react. The first time their disapproval falls flat and you realize with almost a shock that you feel nothing. Not fear, not shame, not the desperate urge to justify yourself. Move forward unshaken. Understand that this new independence isn't just emotional, it's ontological. It concerns the very nature of your being. When you detach your self-worth from the manipulations of the narcissist, you stop being an object in their drama and become the subject of your own life. You cease to exist as a character in their story and reclaim the role of author in your own. That's no small feat. It's a form of psychological emancipation that requires courage, resilience, and an unwavering commitment to truth. And it isn't just about surviving the narcissist tactics, it's about transcending them. It's about reaching a place where their attempts at manipulation are not merely ineffective but irrelevant. They can attempt to provoke guilt, to manufacture shame, to bait you into old patterns, but none of it sticks anymore. Because you know, in a way that is beyond intellectual understanding and reaches into the marrow of your bones, that your value is not up for negotiation. Not by them, not by anyone. This is ultimately the foundation of real freedom. Freedom isn't simply the absence of tyranny, it's the presence of a properly ordered soul. It's knowing who you are, not because someone else told you, but because you have wrestled with yourself, your limitations, your potentials, your deepest fears, and emerged with something real, something earned. And once you have that, the narcissist loses their power over you permanently, not because they changed, but because you did. One of the defining features of reclaiming yourself after narcissistic abuse is your ability to set boundaries, real, firm, non-negotiable boundaries, without being paralyzed by guilt, hesitation, or the need to justify yourself endlessly. In a relationship with a narcissist, boundaries are systematically eroded. They are mocked, dismissed, ignored. You're trained, often subtly and over time, to believe that asserting your needs is selfish, that protecting your time and energy is somehow a betrayal of the relationship. You are conditioned to equate self-protection with moral failure. And that's not a mistake. That's the entire point of the manipulation. Because if you feel guilty for protecting yourself, you won't do it. If you feel uncertain about your right to say no, your no will sound like a question, not a command. And narcissists, who are predators of psychological weakness, instinctively recognize that uncertainty as an invitation to push further, to take more. They will prod at the weakest parts of your self-concept until you either collapse into compliance or explode in anger, both outcomes serving their purpose. But something extraordinary happens when you heal. You stop asking for permission to exist. You stop apologizing for having limits. You stop believing that your time, your peace, your life is something that needs to be bartered or negotiated for approval. You begin to understand that boundaries are not acts of aggression. They are declarations of sovereignty. They are the architecture of a healthy psyche. When you are truly free, setting a boundary becomes as natural as breathing. It doesn't come laced with elaborate explanations or desperate pleas for understanding. You state your boundary clearly, firmly, and you move on. You do not wait for the narcissist's reaction. You do not bend when faced with outrage, guilt-tripping, or silent treatment. You do not engage in circular arguments meant to wear you down. You are no longer playing that game. The transformation is internal. It's a shift from living reactively, constantly adjusting yourself to avoid conflict, to living proactively, rooted in principles that are non-negotiable. You recognize that your value does not decrease because someone is offended by your boundary. Their discomfort is not your responsibility to manage. Their rage, their sorrow, their manipulative tactics, none of it overrides your right to protect your well-being. This evolution is often misunderstood by others, particularly those who have not wrestled with the pathological dynamics of narcissistic abuse. They might accuse you of being cold, rigid, even cruel, but that's because they don't see the years of erosion that made such boundaries necessary. They don't understand the cost of endless accommodation. They mistake the strength of your healed posture for unnecessary harshness, when in truth it is mercy for yourself and for those who would otherwise consume you without end. It's important to recognize that this new way of being is not fueled by bitterness or revenge. Healthy boundaries are not constructed out of hatred. They are constructed out of clarity. They are built upon a deep and abiding respect for the self, the recognition that you are not an inexhaustible resource to be mined for the benefit of others. You are a being of intrinsic value, and that value demands protection. The narcissist, of course, will react to this change with fury, confusion, or ridicule. They will escalate their tactics at first, trying to force you back into the old submissive patterns. They will test your boundaries with the subtlety of a pickpocket or the blunt force of a wrecking ball. But where once you might have faltered, now you remain unmoved. You do not explain, you do not justify, you do not apologize. You hold the line, not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. You do it because you must, because anything less would be a betrayal of the hard-won freedom you have finally claimed. A significant turning point in your recovery from narcissistic abuse, and a sure sign that you've truly defeated the narcissist, is when their attempts at manipulation no longer generate fear, confusion, or guilt, but instead evoke pity. Not condescension, not moral superiority, but a kind of sober, tragic recognition of how hollow and predictable their tactics really are. It's a shift in your entire psychological posture, where once they were the master puppeteer of your emotions, now they are a small figure repeating the same broken script, unable to see that you are no longer on the stage. During the entanglement, the narcissist's manipulations are almost hypnotic. They use gaslighting, guilt tripping, triangulation, intermittent reinforcement, all with surgical precision. These are not just bad habits. They are calculated survival mechanisms developed over a lifetime, designed to disarm your critical thinking and bend you into submission. And when you're still wounded, still unsure of your own reality, these tactics work. They throw you into emotional chaos. They force you to question your memory, your morality, even your sanity. You become tangled in their narrative and begin to believe that their distorted perception of you might actually be true. But when you've healed, when you've walked through the fire of self-reflection, therapy, confrontation, and deep personal integration, you see through the fog. You recognize the manipulation not as evidence of your failure, but of theirs. Their tactics stop feeling powerful. They start to feel tired, recycled, hollow. You begin to realize that every guilt trip is a deflection. Every silent treatment is a tantrum. Every outburst is a plea for control disguised as righteous indignation. And you stop being impressed. This is not to say you become emotionless or dismissive, quite the opposite. You begin to see the narcissist not as a towering threat, but as a deeply wounded, arrested personality, someone clinging to control because they fear annihilation in its absence. You see a person who cannot face their own insufficiency, and so they manufacture illusions where they are always right, always wronged, always superior. And you recognize how tragic that is, but you also know it is not your burden to carry. Pity, in this sense, is not weakness. It's not a regression to codependency. It is the product of psychological maturity. You've stepped outside their game. You no longer need to win arguments, prove your point, or defend yourself against absurd accusations. You understand that nothing you say can touch them, not because your words lack truth, but because they've built psychological armor so thick that truth itself cannot penetrate. And so you let go of the urge to convince. You conserve your energy. You choose peace over performance. This change often happens in a single moment of clarity. They launch into a familiar tactic, a projection, a shaming maneuver, a false apology, and instead of your heart rate spiking or your hands trembling, you feel detached, not numb, but aware. You observe rather than react, and maybe, just maybe, you feel a twinge of sorrow, not for yourself, but for them, for the prison they live in, and the fact that they've mistaken it for a palace. This emotional shift also serves as a kind of armor. When manipulation evokes fear, it destabilizes you. It puts you back in the role of the child, the subordinate, the emotional caretaker. But when it evokes pity, it reveals the narcissist's tactics as feeble and repetitive. You see that you were never weak. You were just empathetic. And that empathy, once used against you, now becomes your strength, precisely because it's no longer blind. At this stage, you're no longer triggered. You're no longer baited. You don't escalate. You don't explain yourself to someone committed to misunderstanding you. You simply witness their behavior for what it is, compensatory, desperate, and tragically stuck, and you move forward without being drawn into the vortex. One of the most devastating effects of narcissistic abuse is that it fractures your relationship with reality itself. You don't just doubt what's happening around you. You begin to doubt your interpretation of it, your instincts, your emotions, your memories. They all come under scrutiny, not because you are irrational, but because you've been systematically taught to distrust yourself. Gaslighting is not simply lying. It is a psychological assault on the structures that help you determine what is real and what is not. And over time, this erosion leaves you psychologically disoriented. You become dependent on the narcissist's version of events, however absurd or contradictory, because you've lost access to your own internal compass. But when you've truly defeated the narcissist, when you've emerged from that psychological maze, something remarkable begins to happen. You start trusting your perception of reality again. And this is no small development. It's not just about being confident in your opinions. It's about regaining ownership over your basic cognitive functions. Your eyes see what they see. Your gut feels what it feels. Your memory recalls events with clarity, untainted by external distortion. You no longer need someone else to tell you what's happening. You simply know. That knowing isn't loud or arrogant, it's quiet, steady. It's the kind of knowing that doesn't flinch when confronted because it doesn't depend on external approval to remain intact. It doesn't seek permission to exist. It doesn't ask, is this okay to feel? Or is this what really happened? It just is. And that internal solidity becomes your defense, not through aggression, but through unwavering self-trust. Reclaiming your reality is also a reclaiming of narrative. For so long, the narcissist inserted themselves into the role of narrator. They told you who you were, what you were thinking, why you did what you did, even when it contradicted your lived experience. And if you protested, they responded not with logic, but with contempt. They called you overly sensitive, dramatic, irrational. They pathologized your intuition until you began to suppress it in favor of their artificial authority. That is psychological captivity. But once you free yourself from that framework, you stop outsourcing your awareness to someone who weaponized your doubt. This doesn't mean you become infallible. It means you become self-referencing in a healthy way. You know when something feels wrong, not because you can articulate it perfectly in the moment, but because your body reacts, your emotions respond, your inner voice rises up with clarity, and rather than shutting those signals down, you pay attention to them. You treat your perception not as a liability to be managed, but as a faculty to be respected. This reestablishment of trust in your own mind also changes how you relate to others. You no longer tolerate people who try to rewrite your experiences for their own comfort. You don't engage in arguments designed to confuse rather than clarify. You speak less, but with more weight. You listen more, but filter more carefully. And when someone tries to manipulate the narrative, you notice not days later in a haze of regret and doubt, but in the moment with sober recognition. That clarity becomes your shield. The narcissist's power was never in their intelligence or charisma. It was in your hesitation, in your doubt, in the split-second pauses where you questioned your instincts instead of trusting them. But now those pauses are gone, or rather, they are no longer signs of fear. They are signs of discernment. You pause because you choose to, not because you are lost. You reflect because you're grounded, not because you're gaslit. You listen to your own voice and recognize it as your own, not because someone else gave you permission, but because you remembered that it was never theirs to take. In the aftermath of narcissistic abuse, one of the most important transformations you undergo is the reordering of your values. And few shifts are more significant than choosing truth over harmony. This may sound simple on the surface, even obvious, but it isn't. It's deeply counterintuitive, especially if you've been trained to prioritize peace at any cost. You see, when you've spent enough time under the influence of a narcissist, you learn, often unconsciously, that keeping the peace is the safest strategy. You begin to equate emotional equilibrium with safety and disagreement with danger, and so you silence yourself, you edit your words, dilute your opinions, and twist your instincts, all in service of maintaining a false and fragile sense of harmony. But harmony without truth is not peace, it's appeasement. It's a performance, and like all performances, it requires effort, energy, and deception. That deception isn't just toward the narcissist, it becomes internalized. You start lying to yourself. You convince yourself things aren't that bad. You reinterpret their manipulation as just being stressed. You rationalize their cruelty as miscommunication. You bury the truth beneath layers of justification because acknowledging it would disrupt the delicate equilibrium you've been forced to maintain. But the longer you do this, the more you fracture, the more you die in pieces. So when you finally begin to prioritize truth, you are, in a very real sense, choosing resurrection over comfort. You're choosing to be whole instead of well-liked. And that's terrifying because it means stepping out of the role you've been forced to play. The peacekeeper, the accommodator, the emotional shock absorber, and into the role of a truth teller. And truth tellers are not always welcomed. They disrupt things, they cause waves, they challenge illusions, but they are free. And that freedom is worth the discomfort. This commitment to truth begins internally. You start by admitting things you once denied, not just about the narcissist, but about yourself. You admit that you were afraid. You admit that you bent too much, stayed too long, rationalized too often. You stop trying to protect your past self from judgment and instead offer it clarity. And then slowly you turn that same lens outward. You stop softening your speech to protect the feelings of someone who weaponized your empathy. You stop pretending you don't see what you see or feel what you feel. You stop participating in the collective delusion that allowed the narcissist behavior to continue unchecked. It's not always loud. It's not about confrontation for its own sake. Sometimes prioritizing truth means walking away quietly with no dramatic declarations, just a firm internal stance that you will no longer deny what you know. Other times it means speaking up, even when your voice shakes, even when people accuse you of being difficult or ungrateful or unforgiving. And those accusations will come because when you put truth above harmony, you challenge not just the narcissist, but the entire system that enabled them. And people don't like their illusions disturbed. But you persist, not because it's easy, but because the alternative is unbearable. Once you've tasted the solidity of truth, the flimsiness of false peace becomes intolerable. You no longer accept emotional blackmail disguised as reconciliation. You no longer keep silent to avoid being labeled dramatic or unstable. You no longer compromise your principles to maintain superficial relationships, because you've learned that peace built on the suppression of truth isn't peace at all. It's a prison, and no amount of approval is worth returning to that cell. You become willing to lose people rather than lose yourself again. You become willing to endure discomfort, judgment, even isolation. Because your allegiance is no longer to appearances, but to reality. And with that allegiance comes a profound kind of strength, a groundedness. You know who you are, you know what you saw, you know what happened. And no one, no matter how skilled in manipulation or persuasion, can take that away from you. In the earlier stages of entanglement with a narcissist, their silence is one of the most brutal weapons they can wield. It's not just the absence of sound, it's the withdrawal of approval, of attention, of acknowledgement that you even exist. The narcissist's silent treatment is not passive, it is strategic. It is an act of psychological warfare designed to provoke confusion, fear, and desperation. You are conditioned to interpret their silence as your failure. You begin to panic, replaying every word you said, every glance, every imagined offense. You rush to apologize for things you haven't even done, just to break the unbearable tension of their withdrawal. You don't just fear losing the connection, you fear being erased altogether. But when you've defeated the narcissist, something extraordinary changes. Their silence no longer induces panic. It brings peace, not because it's enjoyable, but because it's finally unhooked from your sense of worth. You stop seeing their withdrawal as a referendum on your value. You stop interpreting their coldness as a signal to grovel or over-explain. Their silence no longer holds power because your emotional survival is no longer tethered to their approval, and that is a profound psychological emancipation. This change doesn't happen overnight. It is the product of deep inner work, the kind of work that forces you to confront why their silence once had such a hold on you. Often it's rooted in early wounds. Perhaps you were taught as a child that love is conditional, that affection can be revoked as punishment, that your needs make you unlovable. The narcissist exploits those early vulnerabilities with uncanny precision. And so their silence doesn't just hurt, it confirms what you've always feared, that you are too much, too needy, too broken. But when you start to heal, you start to unlearn those lessons. You stop seeing yourself through their distorted mirror and begin to build a self that is not contingent on anyone's response, especially not theirs. You begin to understand that their silence is not evidence of their strength. It is evidence of their immaturity, their inability to communicate, to confront, to repair. These are not marks of wisdom, but signs of emotional stuntedness. Adults talk, adults take responsibility, adults lean into discomfort. The narcissist avoids all of that and cloaks it in arrogance. But once you see it for what it is, it loses its mystique. Their silence is no longer threatening. It's just sad. And in that space, the space where their voice used to dominate, something beautiful begins to emerge, your own voice. You begin to hear your own thoughts more clearly. You begin to feel your emotions without censorship. You begin to reclaim the mental and emotional real estate that was once occupied by constant rumination, by the exhausting task of decoding their moods and anticipating their reactions. Their silence, which once felt like exile, now feels like a clearing, a return, a homecoming. What you once interpreted as abandonment, you now recognize as a boundary, and this time it's yours. You no longer chase, no longer beg, no longer explain yourself into exhaustion. You allow the silence to be what it is. You resist the old impulse to fill it with frantic communication, to fix what was never yours to fix. You don't perform, you don't collapse. Instead, you breathe. This is what true recovery looks like. The moment when you can sit in stillness, even in the face of their rejection, their coldness, their strategic disappearance, and feel whole. You no longer feel that aching need to reestablish connection at any cost. You are no longer activated by their withholding because you've stopped seeing them as the source of your worth. You've come to understand that silence, when free of manipulation, can actually be sacred. It can be the space where you finally hear the only voice that ever truly mattered, your own.